Do you guys remember that Michael Knowles person who didn't understand the first thing about George Orwell? Yeah, he doesn't understand the first thing about Christopher Hitchens either. Also, I'm skipping the entire introduction, just so you all know.
If you meet someone in the street who you yesterday saw executed, you can say either that an extraordinary miracle has occurred or that you are under a very grave misapprehension. And David Hume's logic on this, I think, is quite irrefutable. He says, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and in a way that you approve, or that you've made a mistake? Especially if you didn't see it yourself and you're hearing it from someone who says that they did. After all, Lazarus was raised, never said a word about it. The daughter of Jairus was raised, didn't say a thing about what she'd been through. And the Gospels tell us that at the time of the crucifixion, all the graves in Jerusalem opened and their occupants wandered around the streets to greet. So that it seems the resurrection was something of a banality at the time. Not all of those people clearly were divinely conceived. I'll give you all the miracles and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
Christopher Hitchens is saying, well, what's more likely? That you, the individual, were deceived, or that the laws of nature were suspended? But when we're talking about the resurrection, we're not talking about you individually being deceived. We're talking about 500 eyewitnesses to the resurrection being deceived.
Okay, and what's more likely exactly? 500 people being deceived, or the entirety of the laws of nature being overturned? It's still the first one! 2,000 people in the state of Washington alone have claimed to see Bigfoot after all, but that doesn't make Bigfoot any more real, now does it? I should also note that this 500 people saw the resurrection claim appears to come from the Bible itself. Isn't that coincidental? Specifically 1 Corinthians 15:6, which reads, "After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep." And this should go without saying, but you can't use as one of your main sources of evidence for something occurring a completely unsourced claim from a book, which is attempting to convince you that thing occurred. There's a clear conflict of interest there. I don't know what else to tell you. And by the way, 500 really isn't that much. Remember, somewhere around 231 million people were alive at the time. 500 people claiming they saw something would equal about 0.002% of the entire population. To give everybody an idea just how easy it is to convince that small of an amount of people something false, 7% of Americans think chocolate milk comes from brown cows. If you want a hallucination-based example, okay. How about that time a bunch of Justin Bieber fans mass hallucinated him turning into a lizard live on stage? The last thing I'm going to note about Michael's claim here is that despite using the Bible as a source, the Bible can't even keep this specific detail consistent. Skeptics Annotated Bible notes that in order for this verse to make any sense, there would have to be more than 500 believers before the ascension. However, Acts 1:15 specifically notes that there were only 120 believers after the ascension, so where did the other 80% go? I should also note that while I was researching things for this interjection specifically, I found a video from Prophet of Zod which also talked about this exact claim and made a point that I didn't even think of, so I'm just gonna play the clip.
Let's remember who Paul was talking to. He was speaking to the Corinthians, who live here, about supposed eyewitnesses who live here in Jerusalem. So if you were a member of the Corinthian church and you wanted to check Paul's story, you would have had to travel all the way from here to here in an age when travel was time-consuming, dangerous, and difficult, then somehow find out who these eyewitnesses were, locate them, and ask them questions about something that happened 20 years earlier. If these witnesses simply didn't exist, how would you ever know it? If someone told you an unconvincing story, how would you know you hadn't just found a liar or a crazy old crank and that there were still better eyewitnesses out there? And if, through some extraordinary journalistic effort aided by incredible luck, you managed to determine Paul's eyewitnesses didn't exist, then what? Would you bring your story back to the church community in Corinth and tell everybody Paul was wrong? How do you think that would go over? How successful do you think you'd be pitting your word against that of charismatic leaders like Paul, especially if you were just shitting on a popular story in front of an audience of Christians?
We're talking about all of the apostles being deceived.
Yeah, and what's more likely? That these people were deceived or that the fundamental laws of nature were overturned? It doesn't matter how many people you can list that believe something occurred. We don't base if something happened off of how many people agree with that thing. We base it off of objective reality. And yes, Michael, large amounts of people can be deceived. That happens quite a bit, actually. For fuck's sake, more than 40,000 people believed that giving Bernie Madoff money was a good idea. The idea of convincing less than 600 of them that they saw something they didn't really doesn't seem that absurd.
The earliest Gospels were written within 3 or 4 decades of the resurrection. That would be like me right now writing about Tupac Shakur. And I say, actually, Tupac rose from the dead. Well, if I said that, and if that story was spreading around, people would contradict me if it didn't really happen.
I just want to point out how his example is somebody who a large chunk of the population believes didn't actually die. And Tupac is far from the only example, by the way. People have said the same thing about singer Elvis Presley, entertainer Andy Kaufman, and rapper the Notorious B.I.G. Fuck, there are even people out there who believe that comedian Bill Hicks never died and instead has been hiding in plain sight as right-wing conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. There have also been people who were widely thought to be dead that later turned out to be alive. Examples of this include the famous Paul is dead rumor about Beatles singer Paul McCartney, and Blue's Clues presenter Steve Burns. It should be noted that events like this are also sometimes called the Mandela effect because 1,000 people falsely remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in South Africa in the 1980s. When in reality, not only did he not die in prison, he also was later released in 1990 and became the president of South Africa. I could probably give you tons more examples, however, I think you all get my point. People think somebody died when they didn't, or that somebody's not dead when they are, all the fucking time. This really isn't that abnormal of an event, even in our modern world.
When you see the New Testament accounts, it's referring to people who would have still been alive and whose relatives would have still been alive at the time those gospel accounts were circulating. And then you have 4 accounts, all of which basically agree with one another. And where they would seem to disagree on certain details, they do so in the way that newspapers disagree about news events. In fact, the fact that they seem to disagree about certain details or seem to approach events from different vantage points actually would be a mark in their favor. Because if they were all exactly, completely in lockstep on vantage point and every single line, you would say, oh, this was just contrived.
Okay, Michael's newspaper example is nonsensical in a variety of ways. The main reason people are forgiving of newspapers, and by newspapers I just mean sources of information about an event shortly after it actually occurs, making errors early on is because the event just occurred and obviously there's going to be quite a bit of sensationalism surrounding it, especially if it's huge news. However, that doesn't inherently mean that the details being reported on are any more or less accurate on their own. What the fuck are you even going on about? And none of this is even mentioning the fact that this comparison is just fucking terrible in other ways. For example, the Gospels weren't newspapers written shortly after the events in question. You yourself said they were written decades after the fact. More specifically, the first Gospel is typically considered to have been written about 40 years after the death of Jesus. And that's not even getting into just how little of a ringing endorsement this is. We're not talking about some standard newspaper. Fuck, we're not even talking about the average biography. We are talking about a document that is supposed to convey to me that the person it's about is the literal Son of God who I am supposed to worship. One would think a story so important would be picked over with a fine-tooth comb is all I'm saying. Also, I can't help but notice how you don't even really state what these disagreements are, even though they're apparently so minor. Made even more notable by the fact that Hitchens never even mentioned the content of the Gospels. He's talking about the very concept of a resurrection in the clip you played. There are various other ways this comparison is nonsensical, but I'll just give two more. Michael seems to be under the impression that when newspapers disagree about current events, they are only doing so in rather small ways, which, no, that's just fucking wrong. I'm sure many of you have seen the famous Dewey defeats Truman headline from the Chicago Daily Tribune, which claimed that Thomas Dewey had defeated incumbent President Harry Truman during the 1948 presidential election, which was wrong. Truman actually defeated Dewey. This, however, is a massive disparity from not just what actually happened, but from what other newspapers were reporting at the time, which was that Truman won. And none of this is even getting into how vague of a term newspaper is in this context. I mean, Michael, Weekly World News was a newspaper, remember? Yet I don't exactly see you arguing that Bat Boy was real, because not only did a newspaper report on it, but also several others disagreed with the notion that he was real. Or would that make him more not real? Because some papers claimed he was real. This doesn't make any fucking sense.
The fact that this was all circulated, the fact that we see this in non-Christian sources.
Name one. Not even saying you're wrong, just want an example.
I never said that I attacked bad behavior that was undertaken or embarked upon in the name of, as you put it, religion. I do insist that this kind of bad behavior is innate in religion, is part of religion itself. It's not an abuse of it or something undertaken in the name of. It's a direct consequence of the willingness to believe in the supernatural and the willingness to believe in a supernatural dictatorship in particular. Is it not written that I come not to bring peace but a sword? Surely it is. Is it not written that those who won't follow me shall be must depart and be cast into everlasting fire? Not a very gentle or pacific remark. Is it not said that if you don't give up your family, if you don't give up thrift, if you don't give up everyone who loves you and everything you love to sacrifice yourself for me, you're not worthy? These are strongly coercive and implicitly authoritarian or even totalitarian statements.
He begins by mocking Hitchens for sounding edgy or something. It doesn't add anything to the video.
And he's really misparaphrasing the gospel accounts. Christ doesn't tell you that you have to abandon your family in order to follow him, though you should place him and God first in your life, and then everything follows from that.
You know, it's rather notable that Hitchens was giving really specific examples of things Jesus said in the Bible in order to back up his claim, and Michael isn't. He's just asserting it without any sort of justification.
And he says it's a supernatural dictatorship. And this gets back to something he said in the previous video, too. He says, can you imagine how insane it would be that the laws of nature could be suspended in the course of miracles?
How the hell do those two things relate? What?
You say, well, the natural has to be based on a foundation of the supernatural. This is necessary. The fact that we can speak, the fact that we're communicating ideas at all, which I can't touch, I can't smell them, I can't see them, but nevertheless they exist.
Because they come from your brain, you know, the physical organ in your head, which you can see and smell and touch. To quote from the first result I got when I Googled this, for psychologists, ideas come from the brain, the mind. They're the product of synapses firing and connecting creative dots between thoughts and images and physical responses. The unconscious mind, where great ideas are thought to reside, also houses the bulk of our creative insights. Additionally, through the perspective of psychology, our own individual creativity grows exponentially when we're exposed to creative ideas from others.
the fact that mathematics exists.
You're getting this totally backwards. Mathematics is an abstract concept we created to express what was going on in the physical world. Michael goes on to waffle about things we can't see or something, and insults Hitchens for being edgy again.
Some of your most strongly stated arguments are that violence, death, destruction, the motivation being religion, discredit those who would promote a belief in God. However, I think there's an imbalance there in that the nuclear bomb was created by physicists and is the most demonstrable violence perpetrated on mankind. So I wonder how you respond to that.
Well, physics isn't an ideology. Physics isn't a belief system. It's a science.
Well, I think that would be subjective.
I mean, you could, any more than the Marie Curie discovering radium makes her practice morally different. I mean, it's not comparing like with like. What I'm talking about are specific religious injunctions to do evil, to mutilate the genitalia of children, for example. To take the pastor, Douglas Wilson, who Dr. Craig was just mentioning, with whom I crossed swords several times this year, recently in Dallas. I happened to be mentioning to him about the commandment to exterminate the Amalekites in one of our debates, and he said that commandment is still valid. If there were any Amalekites, it would be his job to make sure that they were all put to the sword. And some of the virgins left over for slavery, purposes better imagined perhaps than described. I think this is a very serious problem. I'm not taking refuge in the commonplace that sometimes religious people behave badly, that would discredit religion. That would be a very soft option. I'm saying there are specific biblical, scriptural injunctions to do evil.
When we talk about human action, we're talking about political action, the decision to create a bomb, the decision to drop that bomb, the decision to talk to somebody about dropping the bomb. That would be a political action that involves society. But at a higher level, what that involves is applied morality. So before you make that decision, you have to know something about applied morality. How do we come to those decisions, and what does our morality say about those decisions? Above applied morality, you have morality broadly, more abstract morality. Above that, you have anthropology. What is man? What is the nature of man such that we can even make these kinds of moral decisions and come to these moral conclusions and engage in these political actions? Above anthropology, you have epistemology.
Step one of making piss. You drink water. Hydrate, 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 hydrate. Wait, it's not... Then what the fuck is epistemology supposed to be?
How can we know anything at all? Know anything about human beings, but know anything about anything? How do we know? And then beyond epistemology, you have the question of theology. What is there to know? What is reality? What is?
That's not what theology means. Theology is the study of religious faith, practice, and experience. I have no idea where Michael got his definition.
Christopher Hitchens stops at, the first circle, as do all of these people.
I just find it amusing how you accuse him of not analyzing theology after playing various clips of him doing exactly that through discussing religion and its morality. Oh, and also, this doesn't debunk a single thing Hitchens said. You can accuse him of not knowing epistemology or anthropology all you want. However, at the end of the day, unless you explain why he's wrong, it's going to look like you're making a baseless accusation or just waffling.
Well, that's just science. Okay, well, what's behind the science? What are the premises that go into that? They don't want to acknowledge that.
The scientific method. That's it.
Some people I know who are atheists will say they wish they could believe it. Some people I know who are former believers say they wish they could have their old faith back. They miss it. I don't understand this at all. I think it's an excellent thing that there's no reason to believe in the absurd propositions I just, admittedly rather briefly, rehearsed to you. The main reason for this, I think, is that it is a totalitarian belief. It is the wish to be a slave. It is the desire that there be an unalterable, unchallengeable, tyrannical authority who can convict you of thought crime while you are asleep, who can subject you, who must indeed subject you, to a total surveillance around the clock, every waking and sleeping minute of your life, I say of your life, before you're born, and, even worse, and where the real fun begins, after you're dead. A celestial North Korea. Who wants this to be true? Who but a slave desires such a ghastly fate?
So Hitchens says it's slavery to serve God. Is it now? Because I'm more persuaded by what Christ says in the Gospels, which is the man who sins is a slave to sin.
You know those aren't contradictory positions, right? Like, even assuming everything you espoused in that clip is true, that still wouldn't debunk a single thing Hitchens said. This is just deflection on your part.
And anyone who's ever suffered from an addiction knows this. You begin using drugs, let's say, or booze or something. You begin indulging in this vice because you think it's an expression of your freedom. I'm free. No one can tell me what to do, man. I'm just going to do what I want to do.
Oh, silly me. Here I was thinking the primary causes of drug addiction were genetic or individual biology, family history of addiction, peer pressure, co-occurring mental health conditions, experimentation with substance use at a young age, or questionable prescribing practices and other factors. It turns out, according to Michael, people actually get addicted to drugs because they want to be free, I guess? And no, he doesn't have any evidence to back up this claim. Why would he? It's utter bullshit.
And what's the alternative? The alternative is a perverted, false form of freedom, a false form of liberty, which is really license, that makes you a slave, and a slave to a much harsher master than God, who loves you.
Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
Sorry, couldn't help myself. Anyway, that's all I want to cover, so final thoughts. Michael, if this is how you're going to argue, then, well, I'm just gonna play this to sum up your video.
Waffles, waffles. Join us, everybody. Come on, Kimba, give me triple berry. W is for the many ways that you serve.
A is for the admiration you deserve.
Because you're fluffy, you're thinking you're
And F is for the flavor that is second to none. L is for how light you are, you melt in my mouth. And E is for eggs.
Baby, put them all together with a how do you do?
Lovely waffles we love.
Turn me up another, please.
Waffles we love.
Top bite off with runny cheese.
Waffles we love.
Chili waffles, soupy fine.
Waffles we love. Wash me down with Aunt Jemima. Waffles we love. Yeah.
Good night and good luck.